The day Owen Mercer lost everything began under the bright morning sun. By sunset, the house he had built with his own hands no longer belonged to him, his truck keys had been taken, and the laughter of his 7-year-old daughter had disappeared behind the tinted windows of a luxury SUV. Standing on the empty sidewalk with nothing but a worn toolbox and exactly $200 in his pocket, Owen watched the life he had spent 15 years building disappear around the corner. His ex-wife never looked back. The neighbors quietly closed their curtains. Everyone believed his story had ended. No one imagined it was only beginning. Before we continue this emotional journey, if you believe kindness, perseverance, and second chances can change a person's life, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Paradise. Your support helps us continue bringing stories that inspire millions of hearts around the world. Owen had never dreamed of becoming rich. He simply wanted to build an honest life. For nearly 2 decades, he worked as an automotive technician, fixing engines that other mechanics had given up on. His hands were rough, permanently stained with oil, and scarred from countless repairs, but every scratch reminded him of another family he had helped get safely back on the road. Money was never abundant, yet his little daughter Hazel never went to bed hungry, and every birthday ended with laughter instead of expensive gifts. Everything changed after the divorce. Endless legal battles drained his savings. Misunderstandings and manipulated stories slowly turned friends into strangers. The court temporarily awarded Hazel's primary custody to his former wife, Vivian, until Owen could stabilize his finances. Losing the house hurt, losing the truck hurt even more because it was his work vehicle, but nothing compared to watching his daughter cry through the rear window as she reached toward him while the vehicle disappeared down the street. For several days, Owen slept inside an abandoned storage shed behind the old repair shop where he once worked. His former employer had recently retired and the building sat empty. The roof leaked whenever it rained, and the electricity had long been disconnected. Yet every morning, Owen stood up before sunrise, cleaned himself as best he could, and searched for work. He refused to let bitterness become stronger than his hope. One afternoon, while walking through a neighborhood filled with discarded furniture after a community cleanup, Owen noticed an old detached garage that had been abandoned for years. The owner, an elderly widower named Harold Benton, was preparing to demolish it because nobody wanted the property. Owen politely asked if he could rent the tiny structure for almost nothing in exchange for repairing it himself. Harold looked at the exhausted man standing before him and saw something many others had stopped noticing. He saw determination. Instead of charging him rent, Harold accepted the only $200 Owen had left and handed him the rusty key. He told Owen that if he could bring the garage back to life, he could stay there until he found his footing again. The garage was barely standing. Broken windows let in cold air, the concrete floor was cracked, and decades of dust covered every corner. Most people would have walked away. Owen saw possibility. Using discarded shelves, second-hand tools, and scrap metal collected from junkyards, he slowly transformed the forgotten building into a tiny repair workshop. Every dollar mattered. He repaired bicycles for neighborhood children, fixed lawn mowers, restored broken generators, and rebuilt engines that larger repair shops considered worthless. He worked from sunrise until long after darkness covered the streets. Sometimes he ate only one simple meal a day because every extra dollar went toward buying another tool or another replacement part. Harold watched quietly from his porch every evening. He often noticed Owen staring at an old photograph of Hazel taped to the garage wall. The little girl's smiling face became his reason to keep moving whenever exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him. Weeks turned into months. People began talking about the mechanic working miracles inside the tiny garage. Customers traveled from neighboring towns after hearing stories about engines no one else could repair. Owen never overcharged anyone. If a struggling family couldn't afford the full repair bill, he quietly reduced the price without telling anyone. His reputation spread because of honesty rather than advertising. Meanwhile, Vivian occasionally searched Owen's name online, expecting to find failure. Instead, she found nothing. She assumed he had disappeared, convinced herself she had made the right decision, and told everyone that Owen would never recover from losing everything. She had no idea that inside a forgotten garage built with just $200, something extraordinary was slowly taking shape. Then, one bright afternoon, a sleek black SUV stopped outside Owen's humble workshop. A sharply dressed investor stepped out, holding a damaged engine prototype that engineers across the country had failed to repair. Owen wiped the grease from his hands, smiled politely, and invited the stranger inside. Neither of them realized that this single repair would become the first step toward a journey that would one day place Owen Mercer on the cover of Forbes magazine. The man who stepped out of the black SUV introduced himself as Victor Ashcombe, Chief Investment Officer of a global engineering company. The damaged engine prototype inside the metal case had frustrated some of the brightest engineers in the industry for nearly a year. Millions of dollars had already been spent trying to fix its overheating problem, and every attempt had ended in failure. Victor had heard unbelievable stories about a mechanic working out of a tiny garage who repaired machines that everyone else had given up on. He admitted he did not believe the rumors, but desperation had brought him there. Owen Mercer carefully examined the engine without making bold promises. He noticed something everyone else had ignored. The failure was not caused by the expensive electronic system but by a tiny manufacturing flaw inside a cooling passage. Instead of replacing the entire design, Owen quietly reshaped one small component by hand, adjusted the airflow, and reassembled the engine. After several hours of careful work, the machine started smoothly for the first time. The temperature remained stable, and the engine performed even better than the company's original expectations. Victor stood speechless. He had watched teams of specialists fail where a single father working inside a worn-out garage had succeeded. Within days, Owen was invited to demonstrate his solution at the company's research center. At first, he almost refused. He had no formal engineering degree, no expensive suit, and no confidence that he belonged in rooms filled with executives. Harold encouraged him to go, reminding him that talent does not become smaller simply because it comes from humble beginnings. The presentation changed everything. Instead of speaking with complicated technical language, Owen explained problems the way he always had inside his garage, with honesty, patience, and practical solutions. The executives quickly realized they were not looking at an ordinary mechanic. They were looking at an innovator who understood machines in ways textbooks could never fully teach. A partnership offer soon followed. The company wanted Owen to lead a new innovation division focused on practical engineering solutions. The contract included ownership shares, research funding, and complete creative freedom. For the first time in years, Owen looked at his bank account without wondering how he would pay next month's bills. Yet the first thing he purchased was not a luxury car. He bought a small blue bicycle for Hazel because she had once pointed at one in a store window and quietly said she wished she could have one someday. Every weekend Owen continued visiting the playground where he was allowed to spend limited time with his daughter. Hazel noticed something different about her father. He no longer looked defeated. His clothes were cleaner, his smile had returned, and hope had replaced the sadness she had grown used to seeing. Vivian also noticed the change. At first she assumed Owen had simply found another repair job. But then local newspapers published stories about the brilliant mechanic whose garage inventions were attracting international investors. His name began appearing in business magazines, technology conferences, and engineering journals. People who once ignored him now wanted photographs beside him. Former coworkers who had forgotten his phone number suddenly remembered it. Companies that once rejected his job applications began offering executive positions. But Owen never forgot the lonely nights inside the broken garage. He quietly expanded Harold's property, rebuilding the old workshop into a modern community repair center where unemployed mechanics could learn new skills free of charge. He hired veterans, struggling fathers, and young apprentices who simply needed someone willing to believe in them. When reporters asked him what inspired the project, Owen smiled and said the greatest inventions begin when someone refuses to give up after losing everything. Meanwhile, Vivian opened a business magazine while waiting inside an airport lounge. Her hands froze. There, smiling confidently on the cover, stood Owen Mercer beneath the headline. The self-taught mechanic revolutionizing American engineering. For several long seconds, she simply stared at the photograph. The man she once believed had no future had become one of the country's fastest rising entrepreneurs. But the greatest surprise was still waiting. A few days later, Owen's legal team filed new custody documents, not to punish Vivian, not to seek revenge, but because he had finally built the stable life the court once said he needed. This time, the decision would no longer be based on what Owen had lost. It would be based on everything he had rebuilt. The courthouse was filled with quiet anticipation as Owen Mercer walked through its doors wearing the same humble confidence that had carried him from a broken garage to international success. Reporters waited outside, curious about the man who had gone from losing everything to appearing on the cover of Forbes. Yet Owen paid no attention to the cameras. His heart was focused on only one person, his daughter, Hazel. Wealth had never been his goal. Every sleepless night, every repaired engine, and every sacrifice had been made with one hope, proving he could once again give his little girl the stable, loving home she deserved. Inside the courtroom, the judge carefully reviewed everything that had changed. The struggling mechanic who had once lived in an abandoned garage was now the founder of a successful engineering company employing hundreds of people. He owned a thriving innovation center, supported local families through apprenticeship programs, and had built a reputation for honesty that reached far beyond the business world. More importantly, every report described him as a devoted father who had never stopped trying to remain part of Hazel's life. Despite every obstacle placed before him, Vivian sat quietly across the room. As she listened to witnesses describe Owen's character, she began remembering the man she had married years before. Somewhere between financial struggles, misunderstandings, and painful arguments, she had forgotten the qualities that first made her love him. She realized that while Owen had become successful, the greatest thing he had rebuilt was not his fortune, it was his dignity. When the judge announced that Owen would now share equal custody of Hazel, the little girl ran into her father's arms with tears streaming down her face. The embrace lasted only seconds, but for Owen it erased years of heartbreak. No business deal, magazine cover, or financial success could ever compare to hearing his daughter whisper that she had missed him every single day. Months later, Forbes published another feature about Owen's remarkable journey. This time the headline was different. Instead of celebrating his business success alone, it focused on the values behind it, the mechanic who built an empire without losing his heart. The article described how Owen continued mentoring young mechanics, funded scholarships for children of single parents, and personally repaired vehicles for struggling families who could not afford expensive service. Success had changed his circumstances, but it had never changed his character. One bright Saturday morning, Owen reopened the tiny garage where everything had begun. Instead of turning it into a museum or selling it for profit, he transformed it into a free training workshop. Every apprentice who entered saw the original workbench, the rusted toolbox, and the faded photograph of Hazel that had remained taped to the wall since the hardest days of his life. Owen often told them that those simple objects reminded him never to measure a person's future by their present circumstances. Harold Benton, the elderly man who had trusted Owen with nothing more than a rusty key and a broken garage, stood proudly at the grand opening. Owen surprised everyone by naming the building the Benton Garage Academy, honoring the man who believed in him when almost no one else did. Harold's eyes filled with tears as he realized that one small act of kindness had helped create opportunities for countless others. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share this video with someone who needs hope, and subscribe to Kindness Paradise. Your support allows us to continue sharing stories that remind the world that compassion, perseverance, and integrity still matter. Special request, please comment. True success begins with kindness. Years later, Owen and Hazel often visited the old neighborhood where his journey had begun. They would stop outside the first garage, smile at the memories, and remember that rainy season when only $200 stood between giving up and starting over. Looking back, Owen realized his ex-wife had taken the house, the car, and even precious time with his daughter. But she never took his skill. She never took his determination. And she could never take the kindness that turned a forgotten garage into a legacy. Because in the end, the greatest victories are not earned by those who never fall. They belong to those who refuse to stay on the ground after life takes everything away.